Good morning, Dan and Amy. Well, the issue of law enforcement and particularly law enforcement's relationship with the black community was an issue raised in Monday night's presidential debate. I'm sure it will be raised again in subsequent debates, and it will continue to be part of the back and forth in social policy circles and political circles. Christopher LeBron, who is an assistant professor of African American Studies and Philosophy, penned an op-ed for the New York Times a couple days ago that suggests some provocative things, in my opinion. He starts by asking some questions such as, am I racially black? I am racially black, and I live in America, which raises the question, will I live as long as I intend? And for more discussion on some of the reviews Professor LeBron offered in his op-ed, we're happy to be joined by the aforesaid Yale University Assistant Professor of African American Studies, Chris LeBron. Professor LeBron, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me on. I appreciate the opportunity to speak about the issues.
So in the op-ed, you essentially suggest that you're at special risk and other persons that are racially black are at special risk in America because of the police posture towards African Americans. Is that a fair assessment?
Sure. Let's start there. That's generally a fair statement. It's not the only thing, given the idea of systemic racial inequality that the candidate Hillary Clinton mentioned in the debate. But sure, we'll start with police violence.
Okay. Well, if Hillary Clinton was asked about implicit bias on police, and she said everyone is implicitly biased. Well, if everyone is implicitly biased, then who's going to teach us not to be?
Right. So one thing we have to think about is that somebody like Hillary Clinton, she's being a good politician. She having just lost the endorsement to Donald Trump for the Fraternal Order of the Police, she can't then go up there and really point fingers, so she has to get very, very broad. I don't think it's the case that everybody is implicitly biased. I think racial implicit bias is pretty widespread, I think, even among people like myself, because we learn lessons from our society about who's worth what, who is likely to do what, and we get notions about people who are dangerous or threatening, and so on. So I don't think it's the case that everyone is implicitly biased. I think certain segments of the population and certain people in certain professions have been trained or have been habitualized to be more implicitly biased, sometimes more explicitly biased than other segments of the population. I don't think it's an even distribution of implicit bias across all of America.
So is one of those professions police?
Sure. Yes, it is.
And explain that. How does that manifest itself?
So there's a good and growing body of work in political science and sociology that have begun to figure out why do we have what everyone now has come to accept and realize as really an overreaching, overly developed carceral system. You know, Michelle Alexander has given us the runaway hit book, The New Jim Crow, and in it, as many of your listeners and maybe you yourself know, the New Jim Crow is the criminal justice system because of the way it often acts unfairly towards Black Americans, in the way that it acts unfairly is historically resonant with previous systems of domination and oppression. So what we have, right, so that's what we have today. There's a growing body of academic literature. Clem Veshler Weaver, who is also here at Yale, wrote a very influential piece called Frontlash, Development of the Carceral System. And basically what this literature shows is that you get the development of this carceral system we have today beginning in the 1960s, at the very moment that civil rights has begun to take hold. And what conservatives did was cede the ground of formal law in terms of rights, and they moved the fight over into criminal justice system. There was a conversation happening in the 60s about root causes, about the rates of crime in Black neighborhoods having to do with poverty that they encountered, about being segregated from the rest of America and having very few economic opportunities. And that strategy of trying to address the crime problem that was in fact in some of these neighborhoods and persists in some of these neighborhoods today had a lot to do with the disadvantage that was already waiting for Black Americans when they got to these areas. In a way, they were in some sense cordoned off in these areas due to lack of opportunity. And so that conversation has gone away. And so what wound up happening is the targeting and the narrative of Black Americans as just more criminals. Thus, we need to build up a much more muscular carceral state. And this take a very long time to develop, and that's what we are dealing with today.
Well, have you read Black Silent Majority by Michael Javon Fortner? Talking about the rise of more stringent drug laws in New York under Rockefeller, and that was actually at the behest of Black families in these neighborhoods that were ravaged by drugs and associated gang violence. You know, they wanted law enforcement because they were law-abiding and they didn't want drug dealers and gangbangers in their neighborhoods.
Yeah, unfortunately, Michael Fortner's book is an incomplete story. And it's a story that has sold very well among slightly more conservative audiences that are very eager to hear the fact that Blacks want the police in the neighborhood. And the part of the story that Dr. Fortner's book leaves out is that it is true. Of course, no one likes crime in their neighborhoods. And of course, it's true that people want protection. But the part of the story that isn't as well emphasized in his book, that is a very robust part of the story, is that Black Americans also wanted, besides wanting more law enforcement, they also wanted to have a lot of community programs that were going to provide opportunities to the young people in the neighborhood so they wouldn't feel they had to turn to crime. They wanted more rehab centers rather than carceral policies for people who are in drugs. They wanted a number of social programs for jobs training, not just police. So Dr. Fortner's book tells really an incomplete story, and it's a story that's been gobbled up by a certain segment of the media and the press, but it's not the whole story. And to be quite frank, it's not even the most important part of the story. The Black community wanted balance in how they were treated. They didn't want just more police and harsher penalties. They wanted opportunities to be able to give these young folks so that, it wasn't either or.
So, like everybody does too. Everybody wants opportunities, and everybody wants safe neighborhoods. I mean, except for the predators. Yeah, I get that.
So, in your academic essay, you wrote that you're not sure how many days.
Predators. I'm sorry. You're going to have to go back and qualify that, because that's language has actually become very charged and
people who commit violent crimes. That's
sure. A lot of people commit violent crimes.
I know. Then I call them predators. Yeah. The people who do.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Right. So in your academic essay, you talked about you're not sure how many days are left in your life, and that you do believe that you're at special risk because you're African American. Do you fear the police? I mean, what does that mean?
So one thing we have to realize is that when somebody like myself writes a piece like this, part of what I'm trying to do is try to activate the imagination of a wider reading public. I see at the end of the piece that I do have a safer space for myself, and compared to a lot of people from where even I grew up, I'm at much, 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 much less risk. What I'm trying to convey to readers is basically two things. Even being at much, much less risk, I'm still probably at higher risk than, like, let's say, many of my white colleagues. I could tell you stories of, Black colleagues at very well-heeled institutions like the one that I'm at, who have been stopped for no reason and harassed by the police just for driving the expensive car that their salary allows them to drive. And these are all true stories. But the other thing I try to do is try to represent a viewpoint, and that is, even if I'm not at as much risk as the people that still live in the neighborhood I grew up in, which was not a fantastic neighborhood when I grew up. I'm at a place where I have the mouthpiece to be able to speak to wide section of America. So there's a way in which I'm also trying to represent a viewpoint. And that's what people do as writers. So I was doing both of those things, and that's why I had hoped the readers would take away.
The FBI data came out yesterday, finding murders up nearly 11% year over year in 2015, the largest increase since 1971, according to the FBI data. And as we get into the data, you look at the racial composition of it. Black men roughly 9 times more likely to be murdered than white men, and the overwhelming majority of those murders committed by other black men. Black men far more likely to murder white victims than vice versa. How do you explain that?
I explain it by there are bad people in the world. So I think when we have these conversations, I think listeners tend to think an argument like mine or made by Black Lives Matter activists is one that says that black people are a special kind of innocent tribe in America. No one would ever say any such thing. There are very bad black people, too, who are very evil, and they should be locked up and all that. So there's no special argument that black Americans are some special class of innocent victims. That's not the argument at all. Number two, no one has ever said, oh, well, no one should ever address black-on-black crime in Chicago. There are groups in Chicago that actually do work on that. And somebody like myself also was very concerned about that. Mm-hmm. But then the step that the part of the argument that's made next is the one that's very offensive. That is, well, just because black men tend to kill each other at very tragic and unfortunate rates, the problem of the police or other civilians killing black men without really any consequence, that's not really a problem. And that's just an absurd argument, precisely because the institution of the police is to protect and serve and to respect citizens as citizens. Being a citizen gives you rights. And so people who make the argument, well, black men are killing each other all the time, the implication is, well, since they're killing each other all the time, the police can do it too. And that's that's an awful argument.
No, that is a terrible argument. I don't think, I mean, maybe there's some people making that argument. I'm not making that argument. That's a silly argument. But there is a rank order of priority issue, right? I mean, the 3,000 shootings in Chicago this year, 11 of those have been police involved and very few a matter of controversy. So in a 12,000 person police force like in Chicago, which is nearly half minority, by the way, you're going to have bad actors. You're going to have bad judgment calls. There's no question. And that doesn't mean that they should go unpunished or they should be minimized because every life is important. But there does seem to be an overemphasis on rushing to judgment even in these cases where the police are involved as compared to dealing with, you want to talk about systemic violence among a small group of people in certain neighborhoods in urban centers.
So I guess I'll put it to you this way. The other way to think about it is that a lot of the violence happening in urban centers, which again needs to be addressed and must be addressed, and it certainly is urgent, and it should be a national priority. So you get an argument from me from there. But the issue of blacks being subject to arbitrary and unjustified violence at the hands of the state is not a 4-year-old problem since Trayvon Martin. It's not a 20-year-old problem since Rodney King. It's a 300-year-old problem in America. And so what people are also missing is that from the perspective of the black community in America, what they are seeing when they see Terrence Crutcher be shot as he's, wobbling back to his car, not being a threat to anybody, what they see in that moment is an extension and a resonance with a 300-year history of black bodies being disposable. So it's not fair to say, oh, well, there's these small numbers relative to the other murders. No, I mean, if we're going to take account that we speak about the history of America, then we're speaking now bodies and numbers in the millions. So now let's speak about numbers and how that resonates in black Americans' minds and sympathetic white Americans' minds, and that's a different conversation.
All right, we're going to have to leave the conversation there, but I hope to pick it up again with you sometime in the not-too-distant future. He is Assistant Professor of African American Studies at Yale University, Chris LeBron. Professor, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you very much.
And he joined us on our Turnkey.Pro answer line.
You've made